When it comes to the life and diet of medieval peasants, you often encounter two opposing views. The first claims that peasants ate all natural food, led active lifestyles, and things were generally fine until progress came along and ruined humanity's harmonious relationship with nature. This idea is often promoted by members of the New Age movement, which includes neo-pagans and similar groups. However, actual research doesn't support this perspective. Anarcho-primitivists, on the other hand, argue that it wasn't progress or the Industrial Revolution that ruined everything, but rather the much earlier shift to agriculture and production economies. The second perspective paints peasant life as a living hell, with peasants depicted as eternally starving and frail, barely scraping by. While there are some facts to back this up, to truly evaluate the situation, we first need to highlight a few key points. For starters, peasants weren't some forgotten minority. They made up about 90% of medieval Europe's population. Essentially, when we talk about peasants, we're really talking about the majority of society. Artisans, clergy, and feudal lords accounted for just a small percentage of the population. They were the minority. Of course, movies and literature tend to focus on the latter groups, but it's worth remembering that the ancestors of feudal lords, artisans, and clergy were peasants themselves. Another important point, there's a basic law of energy conservation. Humans need energy to live, which they get from food. Food has energy value, measured in calories. 1 calorie is the amount of energy needed to heat 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. 1,000 calories make a kilocalorie. This method of measuring food energy by burning it has its flaws. For example, it doesn't account for how well a particular food is absorbed by the body. It also doesn't reflect the need for protein and various nutrients. Still, calories provide a general understanding of energy balance. Humans use energy constantly, while sleeping, being awake, or even gaming, and especially during physical labor. Fun fact, the brain consumes a lot of energy. That said, active mental activity doesn't significantly increase energy expenditure, as I've learned from various articles. On average, a person needs roughly 1 kilocalorie per kilogram of body weight per hour to maintain normal bodily functions. So, someone weighing 70 kilograms requires about 1,680 kilocalories daily for basic functions like maintaining body temperature, brain activity, and organ function. If someone walks, runs, or does physical labor, energy needs go up. Typically, people need over 2,000 kilocalories a day to live normally. If a person consumes more energy than they burn, it's stored as fat. If they consume less, the body reacts differently. Initially, muscles use their stored energy, which, for example, can last about 30 kilometers of running. After that, the body switches to burning fat reserves. On average, about 20% of a person's body weight is fat. For someone weighing 70 kilograms, that's about 14 kilograms of fat. 1 kilogram of fat contains roughly 7,000 kilocalories, so it seems like you could survive on those reserves for ages. But breaking down fat itself requires energy, and without protein, minerals, and vitamins, the body doesn't function well. Within a week or two of starvation, fat reserves run out, and the body enters a catabolic state. Simply put, the body begins breaking down its own muscle tissue to fuel vital organs. After another week or two, even essential organs start being consumed, leading to death. In every era, be it the Stone Age, Antiquity, the Middle Ages, or today, humans have always needed to consume enough food to cover their basic energy requirements and perform necessary tasks. Energy doesn't come from nowhere, and it doesn't just disappear. It can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. Practically speaking, this means that in the long term, no one can survive, let alone work, on less energy than their body requires to maintain vital functions and complete tasks. Sure, you can survive for a while on fewer calories by depleting your reserves, but it comes at a cost: reduced efficiency. Long-term, however, energy balance must be restored to replenish what's been spent. It's like a laptop. It can run on battery for a while, but eventually it needs to be charged. In any agricultural society, there were times of crop failure and famine, and people's diets changed throughout the year. But in general, there are no miracles. The energy spent on survival and labor had to be replenished, or people ended up in the graveyard. Peasants were the primary producers, and a single family might work about 5 hectares of land, an area 100 meters wide and 500 meters long. They also had daily chores: fetching water from a river or well, gathering firewood to heat the stove, and countless other tasks that kept them constantly moving and burning energy. Western sources estimate that a medieval peasant burned at least 2,900 kilocalories daily. Some articles suggest daily consumption ranged from 3.5 to 6,000 kilocalories. To put these numbers into perspective, according to Rosstat, the average Russian consumes 2,651 kilocalories daily. So the high caloric intake in the Middle Ages isn't all that surprising. Take Western Europe during the High Middle Ages, for example, a time well documented in written sources. The average daily consumption of bread and flatbreads made from rye and barley flour was about 1.5 kilograms per person. That's already around 4,000 kilocalories or more. Bread wasn't just food in Christian culture, it had sacred significance. But besides bread, peasants drank weak ale and wine. These weren't seen as alcoholic beverages but as part of their diet, packing about 500 kilocalories per liter. Their meals also included porridge, soups, legumes, fish, eggs, and lard. Still, grains made up roughly 75% of their diet. It's worth mentioning that the 2-field and 3-field crop rotation systems left some land as pasture, allowing for the raising of sheep and pigs. So while meat wasn't a regular feature on their tables, they were certainly familiar with it. Interestingly, studies suggest that 65 to 70% of the diet of 14th century English nobles also consisted of grains, though they could afford the more expensive wheat and its derivatives. A noticeable increase in meat consumption occurred during the late Middle Ages. But even then, being a meat eater wasn't easy. Fasting periods and religious holidays, taking up about a third of the year, required abstaining from meat. By the late Middle Ages, however, fasting rules became more relaxed. For the record, humans need about 100 grams of protein per day, which a peasant could get from eating just over a kilogram of rye bread. Of course, their diet also included eggs, fish, legumes, chestnuts, milk, and cheese, the latter long considered a food for commoners. You might be thinking, really, eating bread by the kilo? Well, let me share a personal story. Last spring, I started running regularly, distances over 5 kilometers, with runs lasting 40 minutes to an hour. This routine sped up my metabolism, and downing a loaf of bread with tea after a run wasn't a problem. Nowadays, people can get by on coffee and cookies or light salads, spending the day at their desk. But constant physical activity outdoors shifts your metabolism into high gear, increasing your appetite and food intake. Speaking of food, monks at Westminster Abbey, according to records from the 15th century, received a daily ration of 1 kilogram of bread, 5 eggs, and nearly a kilogram of meat, when allowed, or the same amount of fish during fasting. Earlier records even mention 4.5 liters of beer and nearly 300 milliliters of wine per day. We often view the Middle Ages through the lens of wars, plagues, and famine, all of which, of course, happened. But even the most conservative demographic estimates show that between the 11th and 16th centuries, the population of most European countries doubled, sometimes tripled. At this point, you might think medieval people consumed more food than we do today and lived a well-fed life. Not quite. Let me give you an analogy. A modern car can run on 10 liters of fuel for a week, driving to the store and back. A tractor, however, will burn through 30 liters in just a few hours of hard work. In other words, lower caloric consumption today reflects a lower need for energy. For example, studies show that in the 1970s and 1980s during the Soviet era, people consumed around 3,300 kilocalories daily, 700 more than today. This was largely because a higher percentage of the population worked in physically demanding industrial jobs, requiring more energy. Interestingly, obesity was less common back then than it is now. Today, about a quarter of the populations in Russia and Ukraine are obese, a typical trend worldwide. Some blame poor diets, but the main reason is consuming more energy than we burn. It's also important to understand that in the Middle Ages, food was essentially a peasant's salary. Occasionally, they might have surplus food to trade for crafted goods, but most of their effort went into feeding themselves and their families. These days, people in post-Soviet countries spend 30 to 50% of their income on food. In Western countries, it's much lower, around 6.5 to 20%. Moreover, the food of modern humans has become much more diverse, and cooking it is simpler. Overall, it seems that a medieval peasant consumed significantly more food and calories than a modern person. However, on the diet we have today, where many of us still manage to gain weight, a peasant from the past would likely have been pushing up daisies within 6 months, if not sooner. The sheer volume of work they had to do demanded huge energy expenditure and consequently a greater amount of food.